I now call a special meeting of the Snoqualmie City Council to order. All please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. Councilmember Holloway, can you please lead us?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
City Clerk, can we please have the roll call?
Councilmember Jeans.
Here.
Councilmember Ross.
Here.
Councilmember Holloway.
Here.
Councilmember Mayhew.
Here.
Councilmember Munden.
Here.
Councilmember Sundwell.
Here.
Councilmember Pruitt.
Here.
Mayor Larson.
I am here. Council, may I have a motion to approve tonight's agenda?
So moved.
Second.
I have a motion and a second to approve tonight's agenda. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion's carried. With that, we're going to move on to, because we have a couple of action items, we want to immediately roll into the council meeting. At this time, we're going to be going into an executive session. One executive session is pursuant to RCW 42.30.110, Section 1II regarding litigation. The other is executive session pursuant to RCW 42.30.110, Section 1II regarding potential litigation. It's expected, I'm going to ask Bob Larson and Bob Sturbank to join the council in the executive session. We expect that it will last approximately 15 minutes. So at this time, we're going to adjourn the meeting, go into executive session upstairs, council, in the conference room. And
I don't see the agenda in there.
oh boy. All right, Jody informs me it's 15 for the first meeting and 45 minutes for the second one. We'll try to be brief as we can, folks, sorry. All right.
It's gonna be 1 second.
I need to wait till Bobby's back. I'm gonna kick the meeting with him. Folks, since I'm gonna be turning the meeting over to our city administrator, Bob Larson, I need to wait for him to return. He's anticipated to be back momentarily. Oh, really? Wow.
Brian, and what about Heather?
Heather had to go home. Can we make a note of that? or
What
not?
time did she leave?
Okay, I call the regular session back into session. Also, at 8:11, also note that Heather Munden had to leave, or she left immediately after the executive session. So at this time, the purpose of tonight's meeting was primarily, as I had committed to the public and the council, that I'd bring a public report or update just to where we're at with investigating some of the assertions and issues regarding the events planner contract, a number of issues that were raised that we'll go through point by point, and also issues regarding the Parks and Public Works Director. So with that, at this time, I'll turn it over to our city administrator, Bob Larson.
Okay, thank you, Mayor. There have been several concerns raised or identified to date, and I'll just go through those regarding this contract for the events coordinator. Contract management issues. One, the payments for work before services are rendered. Two, the quality of work performed. C, the adequacy of the documentation of the work performed. D, a city B&O taxes that are believed to be owed. E, the state B&O license issue. F, the contractor insurance. And G, the city B&O license. I'll start with those. The actions implemented.
I'm sorry, not the B&O license, Bob, just the city business license.
That's a B&O license, I believe. It's an operator's license?
Yes,
Yeah,
okay.
okay. Actions implemented and under consideration for each of these items above. Contract management issues, payment schedule. We're going to provide a checklist for all staff that would be in the position of recommending and or authorizing any payments. B, the quality of the work. There are no concerns from our perspective, but there certainly was a lack of documentation. C, inadequate documentation of the work performed. We're generally satisfied that staff was aware through daily or weekly observations, but clearly, again, inadequate records. Billington has been directed to provide more detailed hourly records. B&O taxes. According to Billington, her attorney advised her that she does not owe B&O taxes and therefore was not required to submit a B&O statement as requested by city staff. The city's position is that she does indeed owe city B&O taxes. In fact, that amount we've determined is roughly about $20 per month, about 30 months for about $600 total. The city will immediately enforce if our city position is affirmed. The state B&O license, she's supposed to be complying with all state and federal law. However, that said, we believe it's not necessarily a city issue, but we will look into that. We have other, just for clarification, we have other contractors that clearly have a city B&O license, but we do not take that step of ensuring that they are complying with all the state requirements. It's not the city's job to do that, responsibility. The insurance, we believe it's not an issue as the certificate complies with the city's requirements. The city B&O license, it's valid. We may need to drop the LLC from the name, but it's still valid regardless of that. The other remedy, of course, is that council was made aware last week, and I'll repeat that the contract will not be renewed after the termination at the end of the year, and that was put in the letter to Billington. I think now several weeks ago. And if necessary, we always have, well, right now the state auditor is reviewing this particular contract. And so we'll see what the findings are from that as far as their determinations.
Did you want to address the ethics issues as well, Bob? Or?
I think that might be a separate item there. On the
Okay,
agenda.
Mike, we could discuss this first. So, Council, yeah, we'll pick up the other potential ethics violation if we just want to discuss any of these items first, or any questions about the particulars of any of the assertions raised, and then again, clarity on any recommended actions taken. Again, we're still sort of in the midst of this review and investigation and still gathering facts. And
One clear one.
Microphone.
If a private company were to hire a contract services, I'm not sure the state would take the position that it is not required of that company to validate that there is a proper B&O license. Consequently, I'm not sure the state would concur with the position that the city has no responsibility to confirm state B&O, just as a matter of complying with state law. Question mark.
The state, I mean, I suppose the state may say it would like cities to enforce state requirements for it. The state cannot force cities to do that, and I think that the issue of what cities can be, whether cities can be forced to enforce, say, for example, federal law is one of the topics being litigated in the sanctuary cities cases, different context, but unless the city's assigned an enforcement role by state law, the city doesn't necessarily have it. The city could, as a matter of contract, enforce that. There is a provision in the contract that requires the contractor to comply with all state, federal, and local laws and regulations. But the city does not have an independent state law enforcement role.
So to be clear, when we enter a contract with any party, we are not validating these particular items in terms of the state requirements, the insurance, or even our own business license.
We're validating, or at least checking up on, ensuring they have a city B&O license. We're also ensuring that if they're required to have a certificate of insurance, file with the city that they have that and it's in proper order and it meets all the requirements. But we don't, as a matter of course, check into the state B&O license.
So as just a real quick follow-up, if a contract spans multi-years and the insurance certificate expires, do we have controls in place to properly ensure that they have continuous insurance?
Yes.
Or licenses?
Yes. We have a very rigorous insurance program headed up, a risk management program headed up by our city clerk.
And by definition, insurance companies are required, if insurance policy is canceled, to notify named insureds.
Thank you.
I'm notified 30 days in advance.
Right.
So, Bob Sturbank, question for you on the business license. I do see that the business licenses, they do exist. They're listed under the name of Lizzie Billington LLC. The insurance certificates are all consistently listed under Lizzie Billington. Is it your legal opinion that were a liability event to occur, that Lizzie Billington LLC certificate would be good enough given that the city license is under Lizzie Billington LLC?
Well, the insurance certificate's under Lizzie Billington,
Correct.
and the contract calls for work to be performed by Lizzie Billington.
Gotcha. So the
that-
business license is erroneous, but the contract that would be,
Contract matches the
The
insurance
insurance.
certificate, so the insured under or the person for whose acts the city is an additional insured is the same person who's required to perform the work. by
so
the
what you're saying
contract.
is if someone was hurt at the ice skating rink, for example, and somehow it came back on the contractor, in this case Lizzie, that because the contract was with Lizzie Billington and the insurance is with Lizzie Billington, you're confident that the insurance would stick on that?
Correct.
Okay.
Even if the contract's for Leslie?
Yes, because we're talking about this.
Leslie versus Lizzie. You're looking at the
No, I
person
understand that,
versus
yes.
okay.
And I wanted to pick up on the comment about the erroneous business license and throw that question to the city clerk. In your estimation, even because it had LLC on there, was the business license erroneous or invalid, or was it still a valid business license? Please use the mic.
I don't issue business licenses. I receive a copy to put in their file with the contract, so I would have to refer that question to the appropriate staff.
Who's the appropriate staff, Jody? I thought you were it.
That would be the finance department.
Finance does business license.
Business licenses are issued by the chief financial officer.
But no, the application's made to Debbie Kinsman, and she ends up usually issuing those when she does a check on those, background checks, so on and so forth. But to your point, Mayor, or to your question, we believe it's still a valid B&O license.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm saying that only because it was represented to me as we've been going through these through the week.
Right.
That even with the LLC, it was just considered an error. We're going to correct the error, but even with the error, it was still considered a valid, paid-for business license under which
Absolutely.
she was operating. So.
Yes.
Sorry, can I just clarify that, did you say, I wasn't clear on who issues the business license?
It's a staff, it's
It's
typically.
not well, I heard the CFO's name, is that true or not?
He doesn't literally issue the license, no, it comes from staff.
Thank you.
It's a pretty minor detail. We have to, for some, we have to obviously do background checks through the police department because they want to be a transient merchant of some type. They want to go door to door, so we do check on those. But there might be others that we have to check on as well. Some involve, for instance, liquor license and so on and so forth, but those are more occupancy issues.
But is it staff that reports to the CFO or staff that reports elsewhere?
It's staff that reports to the Administrative Services Director.
Thank you.
So I have a line of questions. For an independent contractor to do business with the city requires them to have insurance, workers' compensation, commercial property and casualty, an auto insurance policy. Did she have all of those policies in force for these essentially 3 years of contracting with us?
I'm getting a nod from the city clerk. Yes, I know that to be true. Yes.
She met all of the insurance requirements required by the city.
So that includes, I mean, not only just a certificate of insurance, but it includes either a statement in that document or other documents that assures the city that we will be both indemnified, that we will be defended and indemnified by that insurance.
Absolutely.
That's part of the documentation that we do have.
That is correct.
Thank you.
So actually, I'm glad you mentioned that. I'm somewhat familiar with these certificates of liability insurance. Where were you reading from, Bob? What, you were reading from something about auto liability and workers' comp?
All of this stuff I've reviewed, I'm not sure exactly where
Okay.
that came from. I mean, I saw it in the contract.
In the contract, Section
Right.
8, insurance,
Okay.
number 2,
So-
commercial liability insurance.
Typically, not typically, always, if done correctly, this certificate of liability insurance has spots to list all applicable pieces of insurance that have been purchased or that are covered by this company or any other company. And what I see here is I see general liability for $1 million, great. I see E&O for $1 million, which is also great. Errors and omissions, I apologize. I do not see auto liability, and I do not see workers' comp. Now, in my experience in this is oftentimes contracts that require auto liability and workers' comp are boilerplate contracts. And if those two pieces do not apply to somebody, for example, they don't have employees, or they're not using their vehicle for anything at all related to the contract, and I'm talking outside of city, I'm just talking in general, then those two are often waived. What I don't see, though, is I don't see any documentation saying in her case that those are waived, because the box for auto liability is not checked, and the workers' comp and employer's liability, EPLI, is not checked as well. And so this certificate of liability does not meet the requirements in the contract. Now, if we have separately said, hey, you know what, because of what you're doing, you don't need workers' comp and you don't need auto liability, that's fine, because I think there are jobs where that's not required. But I'm not aware of any documentation where that requirement was waived.
There is written documentation in the file. I'd be happy to provide.
That we waived auto liability and workers' comp?
That is correct.
Okay.
And there is, Councilmember Sunwell, a provision in Section 8A3 under business liability automotive that, and I'm quoting here, a statement certifying that no vehicle will be used in accomplishing this agreement may be substituted for this insurance requirement. And that, so it does expressly allow the kind of waiver that you were talking about.
Okay.
That's a common provision in our
Yes.
contract or consultant agreements.
Okay.
So wait a minute, how can you not have that? I mean,
Thank
if
you.
she's not provided a city vehicle and she's using her own vehicle and she goes from point A to point B, which is a project, something that she's working on for the city, how can that not be in the course and scope of her employment where that auto liability ought to apply?
I wasn't involved, Councilmember Jeans, in making the waiver determination. This provision is used for other consultants who perform work from their home or office and don't drive as part of the, to address exactly what you were just talking about. But that's why it's in the contract, to allow for the waiver.
But this is a individual that is required to attend meetings and to attend and facilitate events. So how can you say that they're going to be working from a home location? And that's my problem with this, is that you have to use your car. You're either using a city vehicle or you're using your own car for the discharge of this contract.
If she was an employee, would she be using a city car for this, for her activities?
Most likely, yes.
Okay. So, in other words, a vehicle is required for her to do her work. And in my somewhat professional estimation, that probably should not have been waived here. Because she is going to and from, her responsibilities require her to use a vehicle. It's not just like going to work, sitting at a desk, and then going home. It's not just a commute vehicle. Then that is something that not only we need to look at here, but we also need to make sure we're not inadvertently waiving for other contractors. Because that is a concern. Because here's what's going to happen. If Lizzie were on her way to help set up the movies in the park, okay, and something happened, I can guarantee you we would be named in a lawsuit. And if she didn't have 1 million CSL on her coverages, then we would potentially be in trouble. And so sometimes, although an insurance company could certainly decline this, we could fall back on her personal auto insurance, but precious few people have $1 million of personal liability on their auto insurance. And so that's something we need to take a hard look at for this position and any other position where a vehicle is used as part of their work.
Okay.
All right.
So I want to take it up a level. There are irregularities in the administration of this contract. Those do not focus in on any one individual. They're just irregularities. We have had discussions on the contract and in part have found it weak in certain provisions. My question from there is, I'm not sure we can see the forest for the trees. Are we going to look at independent audit of our contract and administrative processes? We got to get, my opinion is we probably need some inside help because
I think it's a little bit even broader scope than that, because I think that one of the things that we need to be very aware of is that we need public trust in our management of taxpayers' money, and I don't think we have that, nor could we move forward without doing something. I would suggest that we actually bring in a auditor to look at all of our accounting accounts payable practices, along with our contract management, to do a full scope of work in this area. We just had the auditors in, I realize, but their scope of work is usually a bit narrowly defined and maybe not as deep as what I am proposing. But I think we need to, for
it just may be-
public confidence, I want to look at all contracts and I want to look at all accounts payable practices.
Okay, those just maybe two, I agree with you, but maybe two separate things. I think the contract and the contract administration is one, and the accounts
Correct.
payable is in separate.
I agree with
There's
that.
different skill sets, and
Yeah.
Councilmember Mayhew?
Yeah, just a couple thoughts, having been an auditor myself and sort of knowing some of the details of auditing. And it's perhaps just some language, but I want to make the point of, I think we will need to think about an audit. But what an audit does is it takes a set of standards, controls, financial accounting policy requirements, and so on. It takes a set of standards and then tests whether we're complying with those. So that's good, but I think the question we're actually raising here is, do we actually have sufficient controls? So an audit that comes in and looks at what we have and then gives us a report that says, you need better controls, only gets us back to where we're at perhaps already at this moment.
True.
So I think that what we need is someone to come in and look at our processes and controls. And honestly, I see it as broader than just the areas, the two areas that you just mentioned. I can see our purchasing, our contracting, there's enough questions raised here that I think I would have someone look at our payroll, or certainly look at our payables processes. So I think there's a whole set of processes that we should have looked at, processes and controls. And so it occurs to me that something that's fairly broad like that is something that even if our employees have the skill to do, they don't probably have the bandwidth to do. So I think we're probably looking at asking someone external to come in and do that for us. And then once that's done and we shore up whatever process and controls need to be addressed, then I think we ask the auditor to look at that, and that gives us that independent look.
Yeah.
So just to step back, I think we do that because we think we need to do it as a city. Then in terms of public trust, we say, by the way, let's have an independent auditor now look at that and now tell us, does
Yeah.
this new set of controls meet our needs? And by the way, are we following these new controls that we just put in place? So that's what I would propose, I think is really how we need to address this.
And just to clarify, in my world, the audit does include both what you were talking about in terms of, do you have standards, do you have controls, do you have the appropriate practices or processes documented, and then they look at so in my world, it's both.
Okay.
But I'm glad that you articulated that.
I would agree with Jim. I think one of the things I've been trying to wrap my head around the last week or so is, I guess the way I would describe it is, one of the challenges our city has had is if I can try and relate this to kind of the business world, is we are a business that has grown exponentially for over a decade. And that's great. We live in a beautiful place, and we have wonderful people who live here. And with increasing diversity, it's fantastic. But I think what sometimes gets lost in any business that grows as fast as we have grown is what I will call hygiene. And hygiene around processes. And what has come out of this whole stuff is there are individual things I think that need to perhaps happen because of what we've uncovered. But to me, the even more important thing that's been uncovered is, in many ways, we're still Snoqualmie of 15, 20 years ago in some of our processes. Not all of them, but in some of our processes. We've been so busy growing, and having awesome parks for our kids and all that kind of stuff that we just haven't caught up on some of what I'll call the business end of things, that we need someone to come in who's already gone through that and give us what I will call best practices that our city can adopt, live by, and then be measured and audited against.
So I just want to ask for a clarification. I mean, I think we all know we do have controls, but I absolutely agree with the points that I think this has brought attention to the fact that, hey, this is this is something that's fallen down the priority list that we need to bring up higher. And one more area we can just go across the board to try to raise the bar and improve the performance of the organization overall. The concern, or I guess I wanted to separate two different issues, because one is us addressing immediately these specific concerns, and then stepping back and kind of as a result of this, looking at a whole nother initiative, which is, so I just want to make sure we're talking about two different subjects here, which is to take that deeper, broader dive on a across the board look at improving and strengthening our systems. I think perhaps we've been lulled into a sense of security, because some of the council members that have been around for over a decade or more know that we were struggling with every other year at least having a finding and management letters, and we've been seeing improvement in improving those systems and those controls. In that, I think we've gone 3 or 4 years now without a finding, and sometimes without a management letter, and it's been pretty clean. But that doesn't mean, to your point, Councilmember Sunwall, that there isn't some hygiene there, as you put it. Makes me feel like I didn't brush my teeth, but that we couldn't clean up or look at. But Jim, if I'm clarifying, given your experience, you're talking about something that we need to, we have talked about that sort of approach or some of those ideas internally, but I think we're also aware it might be something we would take into the early part of the year as part of a council retreat, because that's a pretty substantial commitment. I mean, that can cost upwards in excess of $100,000 to do that. So am I wrong on that sort of a?
You're not wrong, but I would say that. So I just made a note as I was listening to, I think it was Councilmember Sunwald's conversation about contracting and something. My notes aren't too good, but so when someone signs off on something, say a contract, you need 2 people at a minimum. You need 2 appropriately qualified people sign off that the appropriate details on each of the appropriate details. Do we have, if our requirement is to have 4 types of insurance, do we have 4 types of insurance? Now, it's very encouraging to hear that on this contract we think we do, but my question is, do we have a process where 2 people are looking at to make sure that that's the case? So especially with organizations that have grown, you sometimes become dependent on individuals, especially individuals who maybe been with your organization for a long time, and then when they're out on vacation or so, the problems happen when, so you kind of get away with it because you got one great employee in each key position, but you really ought to have processes that get you there. So the concern I have is, now that we have a number of concerns raised, the question is, how do we know those aren't happening in other contracts? How do we know how big a problem we might have? So I hear answers as we look into this specific contract, but what about all the other contracts? And so my concern is, the longer we wait, the longer we may be in a position where we're exposed. And this kind of review takes a few months to complete. Right. So the longer that we delay, the longer it is until we have appropriate assurance in place. So I understand that there's a cost involved, but I think that there's a risk here that we really need to face.
Yeah, well, I certainly hope it didn't sound like I was saying it shouldn't be something we do, because I think it's a worthwhile investment, and I think, again, we've grown to a point. Because your point, for example, if there's 2 people in the check line, 10, 15 years ago, those 2 people at the check line, one might be the city administrator, but then he only has 4 direct reports 10 years ago. Now he's got 8 direct reports. So not realistic to think he should still be in the checks. And I think that's what you're hinting at, Jim, is it's better maybe to shift to someone whose expertise is more to do the deeper dive on checking all the boxes. And to that point, maybe even the check is lacking some specificity. A pilot flies an airplane 1,000 times, but it doesn't mean that he goes through a specific checklist on everything he checks, wings, flaps, gas gauges and everything, to make sure he hasn't missed or forgotten anything. So I assume in those.
Go through a checklist.
Yeah. Oh, no, that's what I'm saying. But you would apply the same sort of methodology in this case, but that's what you're saying, that's going to be very time intensive, maybe a little expensive, but well worthwhile to go, again, thoroughly through all of these processes and just provide an improvement across the board to make sure that the organization is catching up, these controls and protocols are catching up with the complexity of the organization.
That's exactly right. And just to be clear, there are many firms that do this exact type of consulting. In fact, there are a number in Washington State that specifically focus on doing this for governments. So this is a thing that unfortunately many governments have to face doing, at least in whole or in part. And so I think we need to realize this is sort of part of doing business as a government. I think it's time we do it.
Bob, you might even take the opportunity to reach out. I'm just trying to think of cities who were here 20 years ago, 15 years ago, where we are, and I'm just pulling names out of the air. But, you know, a place like Redmond, for example, who once upon a time were a smaller community and big business came to town, and now they're not so small. But other types of communities like that, maybe even Issaquah, where they've gone through these growing pains. What have the people in your chair done? Who have they hired? Who have they consulted with to update their processes? Because this just happens. This happens in any business, and I assume it happens in any municipality. It doesn't excuse it, but especially doesn't excuse it if we ignore it, which I think, again, the best thing I think that will come out of this is not what happens with this individual contract or people, but what happens down the road. So we're not here 3 months, 6 months, 2 years from now having a similar conversation about another contract.
We have looked into a little bit. The cursory review would suggest that it's not all that common. There are larger cities that have internal, what I'll call, audits, or they have more specialty positions. For instance, they may have someone who's specifically doing just the purchasing. He's the purchasing officer, and everything has to run through that person with a check and balance. We don't necessarily have that. But we have, obviously, we have some folks who wear many hats, so we do have that check and balance still. But I agree with everything you're saying. It's just not that common at what I'll call a lower, what I'll call an organizational level like ours. But it can be done. The folks I spoke to, including AWC, who's got an attorney who does
Association of Washington Cities.
Excuse me, thank you, Association of Washington Cities. They provide all kinds of advice to cities. They haven't necessarily heard of that, but they think it's probably overdue. I also checked with Municipal Research and Services Center. It's an MRSC. It's an arm of local government that does a lot of research. They have attorneys. They have other folks who do research. And again, they asked the question, and they're not really that familiar with it. But again, they were suggesting that the larger cities clearly have that internal function, but they're not too many, except for not-for-profits, would hire an outside company to come in and do the forensics. But they certainly suggested, hey, maybe that's where things are going. It's been done in the private sector. Maybe it's about time the government sector did it as well. The second piece I want to mention, and it's all too obvious to most people, but not everyone, and that is that our test, if you will, would certainly or should come from the state auditor. They currently perform all of our audits year to year. They also perform what I'll call specialty audits. They call them single function audits on contracts that we have, especially for monies that may come from the federal or state level, and those have to get done routinely.
Well,
So
I just caution you, if you ask the state auditor whether he agrees with you,
I'm not asking.
I can already say if you go look at the opinion he issues on our financial statements every year, the state auditor already says the city is responsible
Right.
for internal controls.
Right.
Our responsibility is to audit those.
But I'm suggesting.
So it is our responsibility.
Right, but what I'm saying is if we go over the first step, which is having someone come in and do these studies and forensics, then the state auditor could actually do the test, ensuring that we're complying.
Right.
They would love to do that, frankly.
Yes.
And they have the wherewithal to provide that service.
So
Absolutely.
one thing we have prided ourselves on over the years is the fact that we have done some very forward-looking things in terms of some of our fiscal forecasting that we were doing, et cetera, et cetera. To me, this is a best practice that we should be capturing from the private sector in terms of having, frankly, regular audits of having somebody come in. You gain so much knowledge in terms of what your practices are. Right. And, yeah, they're a pain to go through, they're expensive to go through, but what controls that they put in place and what advice you end up taking away from them negate a lot of the problems that we are experiencing tonight, in particular this issue. So I don't have a problem being a trendsetter in this way and having somebody come in periodically and doing this work, whether it's annual or every other year. I would kind of look to Jim on that issue, but this is something that the money is well worth spent on because we're now paying for not having certain controls in place.
Yeah. Well, and to that point, the council knows that we've been, every year there's just been a stress point in one department or the other where we need more firefighters, we need another police officer, we need another parks worker. I mean, kind of core services that citizens more see as the interface out there. It's less sexy sometimes, or, you don't get public pressure to focus on, hey, you need that internal auditor position, a staff position that sort of audits purchasing and other protocols. But again, this is a good time to, again, turn our attention to some conversations about that as to whether we invest in that. I'm
Once
sorry.
Catherine hasn't had a chance.
Oh, I'm sorry,
to-
Catherine?
Oh, so Bob, so you said the state auditor is currently reviewing this contract, or are they done reviewing it, or when will it be completed?
I could check with him tomorrow, but as of last week, he had that in his hands. He was reviewing it. I expect it won't take too much longer. He's also performing the regular audit of our financial records, so this is part of it now. He should be, I think this sometime this week, perhaps maybe next week. It's just, I don't know what he's done with it. I don't know if he's dropped everything else he was doing and taken this on, but I can certainly check with him tomorrow.
I spoke to him this morning, Councilman Ross, and he just pulled me in his office to notify him that a citizen had filed a formal request to audit this, which we were fine because we had already reported it to him and made a similar request last week. We were going to take it up to a supervisor and request that this be added to his work scope. You know, he just said, hey, just be aware this might cost more. And I said, fine, we anticipated it anyway, so you're you know, on the same page we are. So, and I also said to him, our intention was to continue doing an internal review and an investigation, and then make recommendations for ways to tighten our controls. Just as Councilor Mayhew was stating, it's not their responsibility to make the controls and the measures. You know, we should be doing that ourselves and then bringing it to him as part of his investigation of this and saying, do you believe this to be adequate or satisfactory, that this would help prevent this from happening again? Once we finally get that process completed, of course, then I'm looking forward to the conversation with the council, whether it's, I don't know whether we'll be able to get on top of that in a way that's thorough by the end of this year. But again, first part of the year, these are the big issues we take up as the priority items in the retreat. And then we can start kind of breaking that apart and figure out a way to, I think what we'll keep in mind, though, is to try to allocate some funding in our biennium review to carve out some monies for next year, since this was a 2017-18 budget. And I think one of the adjustments we'll need to make is to try to do some ballpark estimate of what that broader review might cost, and then try to identify a revenue source that you guys could approve for the 2018 budget, if that makes sense.
So are you suggesting that we're waiting until first quarter of 18 to start this work?
I think practically speaking, we're not going to be able to figure out how to define the scope, budget, gear it up and ready. No. On this specific work here, this needs to be
Okay,
resolved immediately.
because I would, well, no.
I'm talking about the deeper.
I would like to, I mean, yes, it's going to take time to go out and engage a company to do this work and to set the scope, et cetera, et cetera. I would like to start working on that now.
All right. Well,
So that we are teed up to go as quickly as possible.
Okay.
It is,
Well, we may need, the council may need to consider one or two special meetings between now and the year, because right now you only have 2 meetings left in the year, and we're trying to finish up a big budget process. So.
I think what she's saying is well, we can't wait till January to do, and I realize the holidays are coming, obviously. We can't wait to start the ramp up on this until January. If it's not January until someone's in here walking through processes and all that, fine.
Right.
But we need to start tomorrow on identifying who those people are, who we're going to contract with.
I'm sorry if I didn't speak that clearly. I mean, I'm saying we'll start doing the homework to basically gather the information. We'll pick your brain, Councilmember Mayhew, about, I think we already have some agencies in mind that can do this exact work, a couple out of Bellevue that are greatly respected in the area. We've already begun this conversation. In
Can we
fact,
have a presentation on who the potential candidates are by council meeting on Monday?
Yeah, I think by the at least, I mean, if not by the next meeting, at least by the first meeting in December, the last one of the year, I think we could by that time have a presentation available to say, this the kind of firms we're entertaining. We have to do an RFP. I think we have a little more flexibility, I believe, if to choose which.
We'd have to receive proposals and then evaluate those. We could have an agenda bill in front of council. I just want to be very careful as I word this. We will shoot for the second meeting in November. I don't think we can put something in front of you as early as next week. We can certainly try, because we have an extra week this week. I can certainly dive into that. We might be able to put we will have to get the proposal out. Maybe we have it ready as an agenda bill for council to send out. But receiving those and actually looking at the proposals is going to take at least 30 days, if not a little bit longer. I gotta be frank about that, not suggesting we're holding off, but that takes time to have these companies have to obviously look at the request and then have to submit something.
So,
have to
and
give it
what
some
I
time.
think what we're saying is there's certain timelines we're not going to have control over. We're not going to have control over the length of time people need to look, other people need to look at it. So I think what we're saying is let's work on what we can as fast as we can, which is get us to the point that we can send it out for RFP ASAP.
Absolutely. If you want a quality product coming in, you're gonna have to put something of quality out, and you can't expect them to respond within less than 14 days, as an example. That would be a harried approach.
So
I'm
just.
correcting myself, we actually have 3 meetings remaining in the year, sorry.
So
Councilman
just
Mayhew?
two quick thoughts for you. So these kind of firms are used to responding to these kind of requests in 2 weeks is a normal time frame for them to respond. And now you do make a very important point, which you need to scope your RFP well. So that will take you a little while to do, but you can get a lot of help
We've got some.
because these kind of requests are done not infrequently, so you can find examples, so you can get a lot of help in that. But the one other thing I just want to caution you about is you may find that these companies' ability to do the work is fairly restricted between somewhere in February and about April. So the very time that you're talking about wanting them to do the work may be the time that they're actually going to have a difficult time doing the work.
You mean leading up to tax time, basically, April 15th?
And when it has to do with times they normally, it's not tax people that do this work, it's auditors, but it has to do with when
Auditors.
audits are happening. So you may find that, you may also find that you get advantageous pricing from them if you do it more quickly. So you might want to at least scope out, try and scope this out very quickly, because you may discover that there's some things impacting your decision on timeline.
Okay.
So they're impacted because they are auditing corporation yearly statements usually. So they're already starting to audit the bank right now. So we're already tying up an audit firm.
You could potentially let a contract in December and start it immediately thereafter.
I would suggest, I think, I suspect I'm just talking for Jim since he's busy, that he'll help you with the scoping. I think that there is plenty of examples out there in terms of getting the scoping done. And so I'd like to see this get out to contract faster than beginning of the year. I would like to turn to another comment you made, Bob, in terms of the backup to the invoicing that Lizzie provided. I'm quite concerned that we believe that the invoicing is accurate. And I'd like to know, I think you touched on it in terms of staff observations and whatnot, but I'd like a little bit more detail because I don't know how you do this based off of a calendar that, you know, there are several meetings in dispute, which is, I know nothing of either side really. There are items on there, apparently, you know, she had for the latest invoice that she was going to be at the council meeting on Monday. She was not present because I've had enough people tell me she was not present. So what exactly did you do to investigate the backup on the invoices, and why are we so sure that she fulfilled all of those hours? Because the contract is based on a not to exceed, not a monthly salary. So I need to understand a little bit better of how you got to the conclusion that we're good.
I want to make sure I read it correctly.
I believe you said through staff observation and, I mean, certainly the events went on,
Right.
we know that, but, you know, there's a lot of things that are in
They
dispute.
also mentioned that there's inadequate records, but Billington was also, she's mentioned, and she's also been directed to provide more detailed hourly records. We believe she's compiling those as we speak. I haven't spoken to her recently, but that's my understanding.
So for what
so
she's
we
billed
have-
already?
I'm
What
sorry.
she's billed already, she's compiling more backup?
That's correct.
Dan?
It's back, Kathy, it's back to the broader issue. The rigor of review was not there.
No, I know that. However, we have made substantial payments to an individual based on invoices that we did not substantiate. We are I don't even know what the word, that we didn't do something with. And that we are now saying, yes, we think they're okay, but I'm not sure they're okay. I think we've paid for hours that we shouldn't have paid for, and I'd like to know, is that something we can carve back? If, to me, the burden of the proof is not on the city. The burden of the proof is on the contractor because it specifically says that she's going to provide accomplishments, and I forget what the language is in the contract. So if she cannot provide that, what is our carve back?
I'm not going to opine on that. I think that's more left to an interpretation of the contract.
Okay?
That would most likely come from the city attorney, but I'm not so certain, since we have already approved those invoices, that it would, hopefully she'll bring more substantial records. As an example, if that does not occur, I don't know what our position would be on that. I'd be of the belief that it would be very difficult to recover those.
I asked Dan to come forward because I know, and I'm going to state from my view too, that there's no dispute that the records are insufficient and the documentation is lacking. I certainly wasn't aware that that was what they looked like. But I can say that although we were a much more larger and complex organization, in this particular area, it wasn't that there were so many layers that she was far removed from the people she directly reported from or worked from. So for example, in my case, I was often emceeing or present at numerous events that she was involved with planning. And so I had sort of a front row seat, constantly watching, checking in with her about agendas, planning details, going to merchants meetings, talking about agendas for a merchant retreat. At least I'm talking about the downtown. And even on one meeting that was contended or brought up at the meeting where it had on our calendar, Ridge Merchant meeting, there is no semblance of a Ridge Merchants group right now, but I directed her to kind of in part of the touching base to see who was dissatisfied with her performance, who was not. I instructed her to reach out to some other merchants that hadn't typically been in the center of things, and we had meetings with merchants that weren't part of the, some of the typical merchants that were involved at times. So some of that did take place. Just because it wasn't with one set of merchants and with another, it didn't mean it didn't take place. So all I'm saying is that I had direct observation of a lot of that performance, and I know Dan could speak to that as well. But I want to make it very, very clear that that does not mean by any means it excuses the lack of documentation, and that this was simply not a proper method or way to track that. Jim, I think in auditor's findings, there's typically, if there's something that's looked at like this, it's either affirmed, denied, or said there's nothing, or insufficient evidence. And my suspicion would be, as we further investigate this and flesh it out, it's probably going to come out to be insufficient. In other words, it's too much subjective or anecdotal data and not enough objective data to suggest as to whether she fully performed the hours or not.
So when I kind of think about all of what's going on here, in my mind, I have four broad concerns. One of them is the process controls we talked about a few minutes ago.
Right.
One of them is, and this is very important, this is very specific to this contract. I think we need to know, and the question of what we do about it once we know is a separate question. We need to know whether we believe and have adequate support to base a belief as to whether or not we have paid for services actually worked or we haven't. Okay, we need to think, no, we received all those hours, and that's a separate question from whether we think the quality of those hours was good or not. Right. The question is, did we receive those services? And I think we have to have a clear answer on that. And if we don't have adequate documentation now, which I'm hearing we don't, we need to go get it now. So I appreciate what you just relayed about certain things you may be aware of, but how many hours does that add up to? Right. And how do we fill that in? And so maybe there are multiple people involved with that. Mm-hmm. Maybe we need to ask for more records from the contractor. But we need, I believe, to make a specific conclusion on this contract as to whether we have received the hours granted by getting additional documentation if necessary, but have we received the services or not? I think we need to be able to answer that question.
Right. So to your point, I think that we're trying to do a combination of that, whether it's kind of from all the staff that work with various events, even if it was the parks crew staff out there helping set up barricades or take directions from her in terms of what city resources to get out and or, you know, if it's Larry, the parks crew chief, you know, working for a few hours with her on certain events, or whether it's Dan's perspective, I mean, all of us were looking at it from different angles. You combine that with, she's already been directed to, as much as possible, go back and assemble as much data to substantiate hours she worked. But at the end of the day, I'm still saying, my suspicion is it's going to be fairly inadequate and fairly unclear.
That's good where there's a timekeeping system in the background you can actually go look at. I do not believe the documentation exists to substantiate, okay? But your question, nor do I believe there was an attempt to defraud, okay? This was just lackadaisical administration of the receipts and inadequate documentation. But I don't believe more accurate documentation exists. And I'm not interested in stuff ginned up yesterday.
Okay, fair enough, but I think we need a straight answer on that at the end of the day that says, this is how many hours we know, this is how many we do not, and let's make a clear conclusion with adequate documented support for whatever that conclusion is, and let's come out and give an answer on that question.
So here's a problem I have. Yes, I agree with what you're saying in terms of services rendered, but she is billed for full hours. In the way she has billed, there is no deviation month over month. I don't know anybody that doesn't take time off of work at some point in time in 3 years. 3 years, there should be dips and ebbs in this. And
Especially when she was working for another city at the same time.
Well, Dan, she did do pretty copious records during the first few, this is 2.5 years she's worked so far, and there were quite a few detailed records in the first several months that were there not there.
Right. The time frame I can speak of was the end of 16, beginning of 17, in that ballpark. There were hourly time frames as to what she was doing, spending between staff time, whether it's senior staff down through the garage, things of that nature. So the mayor's correct in what he said, as is Bob. She's currently going back through her records. She does keep not a calendar on her computer, but she carries one as well. And that has a lot more details as to what's in her day-to-day operation. She also has quite a few meetings, not all of them, but several, that have sign-in sheets as to where she's at, who was there, when it occurred, and the time, anything that relates to that meeting itself. So Bob's correct. She is putting it together. We should have that momentarily. I don't have a time frame for you tonight, but we will get that as soon as we can.
I have a question. So was she asked to bill, let's see, a flat amount every month so that it would distribute the contract hours over the course of the contract over the year?
She's making a statement that she was asked by the city to bill it from month to month on equal payments. So,
On equal payments?
On equal
So at a
payments.
flat amount?
pardon me?
On equal payments.
Not
On
paid on
Equal.
equal
Flat
payments.
amount?
ON, not
So
on.
she was asked to do that?
Pardon?
She was asked to do a flat amount
That's
every
what,
month?
that's what she's saying, and she's going through her notes, trying to see what she has as backup data.
We're asking if you directed her.
Well,
No, I did not.
I am.
and how about the previous?
I did not,
Her
no.
previous person that she
Pardon?
reported to, the previous person she reported to?
I'm going to
Was it
wait
Mark?
until she has her notes. She's going through her notes, her documentation, and we'll see what she has, you know, with backup data.
Mark Hoffman was her previous manager, correct?
We asked Mark.
Mark, can you come up real quick?
If I look at,
Go ahead, Kathy.
so this is August of this year.
So was she instructed? Bill in a
First
flat
off, I'm
amount?
on vacation, so pardon the dress. My answer would be she was not instructed to do so. She made certain requests in the first year that we considered, and the outcome is what it is.
To bill in a flat amount?
Yeah, I would disagree if that is her statement, that she was instructed by the city to do so, that it's the other way around. She submitted certain things that were clarified in 2015 for that portion of the year that began the pattern. So the dollar or the hour amounts that come out of 2015, there's also a tracking of how much is over for that period. So there's a reckoning at the end of the year so that we know that those numbers round off because it was not to exceed.
Mark, if I understand the conversations with you, you're representing that she came in and sort of pressed it. It was a hardship to have the payments made in the mid-month or wanted them at the end of the month, and it sort of wanted them to line up as the payroll was. And for our purposes, it was more efficient to sort of have it processed with some of the other payroll and so forth. And my speculation, I guess I wanted you or Bob or someone to confirm, was that, you know, it wasn't her tracking the details, but what we probably failed to do, or what we failed to do, was if she was getting paid mid-month for the prior month's full work, then when we shift it to a payment at the end of the month, rather than flipping the work, you know, performed in the same manner or making that shift, the work performed stayed at the same place, but the payment shifted, and that's where the sequence kind of got out of sync, where we're paying always.
Well, the regularity started right off the bat.
Clarify something? I thought that she was always being paid within the month of the work. There was never a time frame under any of her contracts where she actually waited until the following month to be paid for the prior month. Is that not a true statement?
The way I view it, it was towards the end of the month, there was a deadline. If you get your invoice to us by this date, we will process it. If you miss that deadline, and we clarified that if you miss this deadline, it'll go in the next round of invoices.
Okay.
So you're correct. You're correct.
Oh, okay.
There's never been a month where so for example, there was never a time where she billed on like February 3rd for January. That never happened. It was always 10 to 11 days, and it creeped further up as we got into this year in advance. She was always turning in an invoice 10 to 11 and sometimes more days prior to those services being completely rendered. So I'm not really sure where this payroll switcheroo thing that you're talking about happened.
I'm not talking about any switcheroo. If what you just said mirrors my experience. I am not aware of any month where we paid 30 days after.
So
Do we have-
My guess, without looking at them, that we always paid early.
let's look at June of 2015. At least from, there's a gentleman, I assume he's in the audience, who did some work here. Says the invoice for June of 2015 was turned in on June 1 and was paid out June 25th. You may also look at August, which actually we have the receipts here, of this year, was turned in on August 14th, was paid out on August 17th. September 11th was invoiced and paid out on September 14th. So check those dates, guys. I don't have any other evidence than what was handed to me by a private citizen, but his understanding of the record, there's some goofiness here.
So do we have any other contracts that we are paying in the same month for work that has not yet been completed?
I will state that I'm not aware of any, and I almost want to say emphatically no. We've always waited till after the end of the month for the rest of those contracts, for consultants, for contract payments, whatever they may be. We receive them after the end of the month, usually within the first 6 days of the next month, and we pay out accordingly afterward, after they've been obviously verified for payment.
Bob, do we have or have we had, I mean, what strikes me as being unique about this contract is this is the only contractor that has been essentially requested to devote essentially the full amount of their time of their business to one customer. And is that maybe what caused part of the?
I can't speculate, Mayor, I'm sorry. I will say that as far as I know, until more recently, I'm not aware of her having any other work with any other entity. Ours was the sole business for her.
So her contract does not prohibit her from doing any other work, correct?
As far as I understand the contract, that's correct.
So, you know, having a little event planning experience in my life, there are events that, for instance, railroad days or the holidays, which I would imagine that she would work a huge amount of hours, and then there are certain months that she would not work because of the amount of either meetings or economic development that we're asking for, or the fact that they're just the type of events that don't take a lot of planning. So the fact that we're seeing an even amount of money being requested on each invoice, I'm sorry, I feel like there's a little bit of misrepresentation, and I really don't want to call it fraud, but I'm to the point where This stinks, people.
Well, and unfortunately, I think at this stage, she submitted record, we signed off on it. It's now on us to prove otherwise, if
Yep.
we really think it, and the
We're-
record just doesn't show that.
We're not at all disputing that this is goofed up. I mean, and we missed this. I mean,
And
but guys-
I appreciate the fact that both you and Bob Larson have taken that point of view. I really do. I know, as tough of a conversation to have as it is for us, so I do appreciate that. I want to go on record for that.
So prior,
I mean, yeah, we're just trying to separate fact from fiction, get to the points that we're seeing are, we're clearly controls are areas that we missed and where errors occurred, and then shift to appropriate disciplinary actions, and then again, make sure we're putting appropriate measures and controls into place to assure that doesn't happen again. And I'm very gratified that the council is willing to support going the next step above and beyond and doing investing in a comprehensive look at this across the board. I mean, I think we are at a history in our city where this is a good investment to make.
So
Councilmember Jeans.
let me make this point, and I'm really sort of repeating Councilmember Mayhew. We have a need for a broad a broad investigation by someone other than the city, probably something other than the state auditor, and there are people like that, and those people or that person that I want us to hire. We should explore that in the next couple of weeks so that we know kind of what it would cost to hire such a person, because that person can help us on the Lizzie contract as well as these other contracts. Not to have a determination before the end of the year, but we need to start the process now. That process probably involves a special budget adjustment, and with such a high priority on this matter for us council and for our citizens, I think it would be money well spent to hire that person sooner rather than later, so that when we have a retreat in February, we know what the problem is, and then we can focus on the solutions. I don't want to focus on the problem in February and start working on it. We need to focus on it now, and we need to make budget adjustments. We need to pay for creating, understanding where we are and understanding how we can fix it.
So I'll ask Bob to respond to that, or Bob Larson to respond to Bob Jeans.
As I mentioned earlier, if council, that's your prerogative, I completely understand it. I'll put 100% effort into it this week and get it ready for you next week. At least the parameters of what you want to look at as far as the request for proposal. They'll have to go to the full council, I believe, on the second Monday of November. I think it's the 13th. You can take a look at that in committee next week. We will put it out there. I just want to make sure we're being frank in explaining that, as Jim, I think, tended to agree, is that we need to give these folks some time to submit, and I would think 14 days is reasonable. And so we could have that in our hands by the end of November, maybe sooner. Perhaps you could have this in your hands as an agenda bill as early as maybe the 4th Monday of November, maybe. But that would require us to expedite that without a thorough council review of that request. If that's what you want to do, we can certainly put that in action. Otherwise, it'll have to wait till the second Monday in December.
I don't want to wait. I will tell you, and I only speak for myself, the rest of council has to speak for themselves. This is important enough. We need a special council meeting. We need to speed up the process, Bob. We need to get the scoping done. We need to do whatever we need to do to get somebody contracted in here sooner versus later. So whatever we need to do, wherever you need council to show up to make a legislative action to get this put in place, I am there, because this is serious enough that we don't, enough said.
I'll just make sure I'm clear. I believe that the council does not, as a body, have to approve distributing a request for proposals. But you do have to ultimately approve, obviously, looking at a contract, is that
I
correct?
think this is serious enough.
Okay.
I don't think you want to scope this out without having council at least be able to weigh in on it.
Well, we can send it, we can get it ready for committee next week. It'll be rushed, but I get it done this week. That would require council's effort next week in each of your committees to take a look at that. And then right shortly thereafter, we can send it out. We don't need to have a full council approval. If you want to look at it, that's one thing. You don't necessarily have to approve us distributing a request for proposal.
Dan, quick question for you. I'm just looking at
I'm
more.
sorry, before we launch away from that subject, I saw a couple nods of heads. Is there a concurrence with the council with Councilmember Pruitt's
Yeah,
position?
what she said.
What she said, I'm not sure you guys get it, okay? I mean,
Brian, I don't think you.
I'm sorry.
Or Councilmember Holloway, you're not getting any pushback from us.
No,
We're-
the problem is I am, okay? You've told me there are no checks cut to the end of the month. Here's 2 of your voucher records. They're mid-month, okay? I'm not faulting any individual here. The organization is at fault.
Yeah.
But I'm not hearing the organization saying, it needs this. I'm hearing you, Bob, say, if the council wants it, we'll do it. The organization is still at fault.
I can't hire someone, Brian, to do these things. It's a council requisite. I
Make
can
a
only
request to
recommend. And we've been through that before. We've discussed these things. This is new of a nature to the Washington State for general government. I'll tell you that, coming from another state. This is not routine stuff. I can't authorize these things, and neither can the mayor, frankly.
But
If you want to look at a contract, we will certainly bring it back. We're not disputing that issue whatsoever.
As I stated, I'm quite grateful. I'd love to do this,
And I
but I need to be respectful of and mindful of the fact that I need the council's support and to go forward with it. And if the council wants to go faster, I'm totally on board. Let's go.
Yep.
And I
Maybe a
think
special meeting call.
I speak
Faster.
for Jim and myself, who regularly, and probably Brian, we have all worked with audit scopes and can help you scope this out.
Okay.
Also, if you wanted to tonight,
Bye.
you can
And-
certainly authorize something immediately tonight if you wanted to.
Well, let's get the
I think you've
proposals
got to
in.
get the scope.
Yeah.
I want to see your scope statement, Bob, because again, I think
Thank you. That's what
you may need
I'm-
input from the council.
we're
on
trying
that.
to adjust to that. That's what I'm saying. You could authorize today if you wanted to, authorize an expenditure. We can move this tomorrow if you wanted to.
Yeah, again, we're trying to be respectful of not rushing the council through a process, but if you're willing to commit to whatever speed you want to go, if you want to have 3 council meetings this week, you know,
You guys know me, I've done that.
So,
Sorry.
Dan.
I was
Councilmember
on the phone till 3 o'clock in Boston on this issue. I am there. I'm
I was
invested.
I was impressed. Thank you.
So,
Councilmember Mayhew.
Councilmember Sundwall, just a thought I have is that, having heard the comments just made about this information, I'm sort of reflecting on what I heard earlier, which is we're still looking at things, and thinking about Councilmember Jean's comment. I think that the city doesn't, that the administration does not yet know all of the facts here.
Right.
And so I think we can keep sort of pressing on this tonight, and I think all we're going to do is continue to see that in more detail. I would propose that we need the administration to finish that work on the specific question of, do we have support for these hours, or can we obtain, this is an ongoing contract, so we still have a relationship with this contractor. Can we obtain sufficient, satisfactory, not newly created support?
Yeah.
For, to what extent can we, what extent can't we? And let's come out with a report, I think something in writing that says, here's what we've concluded. So to get to that conclusion, on the council continues
Because
have your office being a filter.
Yeah, here's the, oh, no, absolutely not. But here's the point, you will not be inundated with complaints. We simply don't receive that many. I mean, offhand, I would say I'd receive it most once every week, if not one every 2 weeks. In fact, I go 3 weeks without, or 3 or 4 weeks often without seeing a complaint. So you won't have your email boxes inundated.
Okay,
Unless people stay off of Facebook and start using this instead, but.
other than I have a higher duty as a father and am a single parent tonight, can we move to the next agenda? Because in about 10 minutes, I'm going to check out and do my higher duty.
He's got 4, he'll talk fast.
Yeah, well,
and
my
we won't
fourth one, I
open it.
think, lines up with Councilmember Holloway's concern. So the fourth concern I have is around the topic of this potentially a conflict of interest policy and failure to follow that was a twisted sentence. So that's my fourth concern, and perhaps it's the next item on our list, but I think we need to address this concern that's been raised and where we stand on that.
Can I bring back one more on the contract, and then we can go on to ethics? When do we think that, have we demanded the B&O tax from Lizzie, the 600 that is owed?
I'll check
When are we-
tomorrow.
When are we collecting it?
I'll check tomorrow. I do not know that answer right now.
I pressed hard on that matter. She's pressed hard back that she's adamant that her attorney has advised her she doesn't owe the B&O. We're pretty adamant that she does.
And she doesn't get a paycheck until she pays it.
I guess that's the way to do it.
You mean an
It's not a
invoice paid?
paycheck.
An invoice, thank you.
Invoice, thank you.
A check with pay on it.
Yeah, I've been asking for a few days now for her to produce a memo from her attorney that if she feels that's the case, or he does, then please quote RCWs or Snoqualmie Municipal Code or what legal basis by which they think that interpretation is valid. But I like your idea of withholding invoice until.
Have no clause for retention. They are separate legal matters.
All right, I'll leave that up to the attorneys and other folks to figure out.
So
All right,
can
but
we switch to the
we are pressing on that matter.
Let's go to the ethics.
All right.
If I could just interrupt just a second, Jim, I was taking notes and I didn't pick up your number 2 issue. I'm sorry. Got those.
The
If you wanna
first
share
concern
the-
was process controls. The second was a clear conclusion by the city as to whether we
Okay.
have a base, whether we believe we have received the hours we've paid for,
Okay.
and to what extent we believe that or don't know.
Got it. I got that as number 1, I'm sorry. Process control, they got that one too. That's why I got those. Very good, thank you.
So on to ethics.
Yes.
All right. The other issue here I'm going to address is a potential ethics violation, conflict of interest, however you want to put that in there. The first item is the timing of the outside business venture, and the subs under those, the subtitles are the contract with the city of Snoqualmie, the fact that Mark Hoffman was your initial direct report for Lizzie, Billington's contract. Billington entered into then after that, Billington entered into a LLC with Dan Marcinko unbeknownst to city officials. And then Dan Marcinko became Lizzie's direct report after we removed economic development activities from the contract. That's what Mark's oversight would have primarily been. And we're also trying to establish perhaps no activity occurred involving the LLC between Billington and Marcinko. However, it appears the intent was established for a business venture. And so we've got a potential ethics violation and or a conflict of interest issue with our ordinance. We're going to ask the council to hire an independent hearing officer to be appointed, and after a thorough investigation, that person will make a recommended action for the city to take, if any. I understand that Dan Marcinko has dissolved his interest in this LLC in question, and from now until the end of this contract, however council wants to establish that with Billington, she will be reporting directly to me for the remainder of that period.
So it is my understanding that Dan just dissolved his interest in the LLC when
I don't
this
know the
brought
exact
to
date,
light?
but as of today, I understand he did dissolve it, his interest.
Okay.
He can
My-
speak that issue if you want him to.
When did you dissolve your interest?
Last Thursday, Friday.
Okay, thank
To
you.
remove your name, Dan, or actually refund your investment or what?
Remove the name, working on the financials.
So working on a refund of the investment from the LLC. Okay.
So, go ahead.
So I concur with, let's get the conflict of interest advisor and find out what standard practice is here. But I will also point out, again, the organization is at fault too. The organization had a culture in which it was believed this was okay. So that ethics advisor also needs to look at what are the organizational procedures and what are the culture change events that need to occur to get the organization whole again in regards to its conduct of ethics.
I will further state, and I apologize for not including this with my other previous comments, there's 3 steps we can take. Well, one, we already have the policies, and it's actually codified in our ordinance on the conflict of interest as well as the ethics issues. That's well established. It's also state law. 2, we need a procedure, perhaps an annual procedure for all officers of the city. I would suggest that'd be all senior staff who have any direct relationship or responsibility over, I'll call it fiduciary issues, contracts, so on and so forth.
All employees, not just
All
the.
I'll get to that in a second. The third one is that we need to ensure compliance, which would be a mechanism to that. Obviously, someone's tracking these things, that people have actually filled out the forms, have signed them, and returned them to a responsible person. The issue about all, I'll just open it up because it's going to be an issue. We have union employees. In fact, I would upwards of 75% of our employees, 75 people or more, are union employees, either police, either fire, or Teamsters. That is going to be an issue.
For them to acknowledge that the city has a code of ethics and to go through ethics training.
We can ask them, we can put them through ethics training, we can ask them to sign forms that they actually participated, but we can't demand that they fill out forms that would go to the issues of, do they have conflicts of interest, either potential and or immediate.
So two middle-level folks in parks can form whatever business they want.
Not suggesting that.
And there's nothing there's nothing.
That's not what he
No,
said.
that's not what he's saying.
That's not what he said.
We're talking about the ethics and the conflict of interest as it relates to city business from a city employee and or officer or elected official. I'm just suggesting, I'm not saying you're going to have issues, but you may have issues clearly with union
What
employees.
he's saying is you can't, so yearly, I signed a code of conduct.
At Boeing.
At Boeing. It is a requirement of employment. Matter of fact, in some of my review, I found out there's actually a penalty if I don't. It's 1 week off without pay. So I could if I want. Okay, but for those contracts, you can't have them sign a code of conduct without the union concurrence. Now, I think you can ask the union, and I'm not see if they'll accept it or not. This is just saying, I will not do bad things. It's not necessarily a.
So at the bank, we have all employees sign that they acknowledge that there is a code of ethics for the organization. And they participate in training on the code of ethics. That is all employees. For anybody with fiduciary responsibility or an officer or a senior level position, we also have to sign a statement to the effect that we have not breached the code of ethics. Within that training of the code of ethics is also a whistleblower procedure. To get back to Jim's comment about public, you also need a vehicle for employees, and it's got to be pretty beefed up because of a smaller organization. It is a little bit harder to have a whistleblower process. So that is what I am suggesting to you. So I can't imagine that the unions would be upset with a simple, I acknowledge that there is code 2.80 Code of Ethics within the Snoqualmie Municipal Code.
I will tell you, each employee receives a copy of the policies and procedures of the city upon hire. They acknowledge they've received those. Periodically, we've gone back, and if without bargaining these issues, you will have a contention from the union that you've changed the conditions in terms of their employment. We can remind them that they should be aware of these things, but we've had employees who've gone through training who will not acknowledge with a written signature that they've gone through that. They will not acknowledge it. We've handed them the paperwork. We've asked them to acknowledge it. I'm just saying that's the issue. I'm not suggesting we want that to happen.
I think that's a practice then that we need to take a look at, because this needs to be a formalized annual process
We can-
that
And
every
we're
year.
in 100% agreement,
we
so.
agree.
so
Are we
the
coming
internal-
up on negotiations again?
We'll take it to the unions, we'll talk to them about it, but it's,
And it doesn't preclude, we can't try to persuade them to do it voluntarily. My reaction when I heard these issues was, well, that doesn't prevent us from moving forward quickly with those that are non-union, management and professional. We can certainly implement that immediately. So, and again, to emphasize, Bob, I just want to check what you said again. Regardless of the issues you just identified, every single employee, every single council member or a mayor that starts working for the city reads that code of conduct and the ethics and signs it before they start their employment, so.
We did that several years ago.
We did,
I
and
think it's time to do it again.
And I was just going to go on to suggest that I think it should be done for council members and the mayor as well.
I agree.
Because it dawned on me, and like Brian and I even discussed this issue, because we're trying to vet ideas for how do we put a mechanism to improve. Because even in the case of Dan, we own responsibility for not having a mechanism to remind an employer. But it dawned on me, I said, well, Brian, great, you do it at Boyne all the time. How come you never challenged us at the council of the city to say, why weren't you doing it here as a council member? So, and I mean, he's not disagreeing. I mean, we're just saying, yeah, it just, okay. But now that it's come to
We
our.
did the practice at one stage. I
Maybe
agree.
you
We
should
let it
go
fall
home
aside.
with your higher duty.
Hmm?
Maybe you should go home and hand your higher
should.
duty.
But so that's to us is a pretty obvious, easy one that we could implement immediately, but then start to work in conversation with the unions to do that across the organization.
Okay,
Councilor Mayhew?
so the point of, having actually, in my professional career, a fair amount of experience investigating this specific type of thing, I'm actually familiar with how these, many other instances of similar circumstances, I'll say. So let me just say, I break it down in my mind to just a couple things. The first thing I want to be clear on is, and listen to my specific words, have we established whether there were invoices approved where the approver, in doing so, violated our conflict of interest rule? I didn't say intentionally, I just said, was it in
this
fact
spe-
in
this
violation?
specific
Do we
case-
know?
You mean in this specific case?
Yeah, in this specific case.
I think it's going to be left to a hearings officer to investigate
So we
that.
don't know the answer to that.
I do not want to make an opinion about that.
Yeah,
think we know the answer.
I do have a question for
Depends on
Bob.
how you phrase it.
So you said, when you're going through the whole list, you said there's no activity occurred. What does that mean? No activity with the company, or no activity, the company's had no activity? What does it mean?
It appears with the LLC that there was no actual transactions made, no business transactions were made. That's what it looks like. But again, we have to have this hearings officer conduct a thorough investigation.
Or verify investigation. So what I know to date was Lizzie had represented that they had started forming the business venture back in, I believe it was as far back as 2015, but it took close to a year to get the federal approvals and everything and all the ducks in a row. And that's why you see the date of, what was it, Dan, February, or
Wait a minute,
2006?
guys,
So,
guys, wait a minute.
And I asked her to provide me with evidence to suggest there was no activity, and I got, from the time that it was established, monthly reports showing zero activity up until the present time.
the problem is it's not the business that didn't have activity that violates your ethics. It's the fact that there was no disclosure.
I understand that. That's not, the question was asked to me about the activity and when it started, and I was simply answering the question.
I think it's important to leave that to a hearings officer to do that investigation, because there's going to be a complaint from one of the officers here, either a council member or one of the senior staff, either by the mayor or the mayor, alleging that conduct. Because clearly, we believe that the intent was established. I've already said that for a business. Whether or not it actually got off the ground, that's immaterial.
True.
So I want to make sure that we're clear again about that. So it's up to the hearings officer, though. We have to have due process with this.
Could you explain the process of appointing a hearing officer? Because there is quite a bit of consternation about the administration appointing. And so what do you look at for the qualifications? Why we don't have a ethics hearing examiner named on an annual basis, similar to what we do on some of the other boards, et
I'm going to
cetera?
defer that to the city attorney. We've looked at it extensively.
Well, I can answer some of those questions. The code, there's a code provision that creates the ethics hearing officer position. That's 2.80.050, which creates the Office of Ethics Hearing Officer, who shall be appointed by the mayor and confirmed by the city council. And that officer shall be an attorney, not holding any other elective or appointive office with the city. So we have a hearing examiner who hears a variety of land use matters. That provision would say you can't use the hearing examiner. That person already holds an appointed office with the city. Then the code, the following the succeeding section goes on to describe the powers and duties. This provision as to the creation of the position doesn't speak to the employment history or qualifications or anything like that. There are attorneys who practice in corporate and other ethics. There are attorneys, municipal attorneys, who have that as a regular part of their practice. One, for example, Steve DiGiulio has for the last 26 years taught municipal ethics to new council members for AWC, and he's been doing that as part of the conference as a regular part of his practice. Seattle, for example, has an appointed ethics commission, a multi-member board and staff. Their executive director, who is an attorney, has an approved contract to be available to serve as the ethics hearing officer for the city of Kirkland. We inquired with them. Approving a contract like that would take action by the Ethics Commission, which meets only once monthly and is scheduled to have their regular meeting in December. So there are private practitioners we could look to. We can look to other public agencies. And then, like other appointments, the mayor can bring a recommended appointment to the council for confirmation, at which time the council could vet the person's resume, experience, and general familiarity with ethical issues.
So is it,
I will say, for my time in the city, which has been going on 4 years, I don't believe that there has been an occupant in this position. I'm not aware of any ethics complaints being filed which would trigger that person's service, or a request for an advisory opinion, which is the other category of things that the ethics hearing officer attends to.
so what I'm hearing is we could contract for just this exam, or there's a possibility of doing a contract for these services, and I assume you can structure it around that you only pay if you use the contract
Right.
type thing.
Yeah.
I would suggest that we actually have a formal process in place so that we don't get caught with a delay.
That's our going to be our recommendation, yes.
Sure.
So it sounds like there is statute that controls what this is. But
It's the
there's
city
probably
code, actually.
a lot of judgment that might go into the mayor's recommendation to us. And so I might suggest to the mayor and suggest to my council members that be someone beautifully qualified or not, but that does not have any prior experience with the city of Snoqualmie.
Yeah, I agree.
I might also suggest, and I may regret having done this, and maybe no one will agree, but it seems to me like, so it has to come before council, because we have to confirm it, correct? That maybe we have 2 or 3 options. So, is that reasonable, Bob?
I anticipate that the cost of the hearing, for this process, I'm hoping it would be less than $10,000, which I'm authorized to proceed with, and I assume that none of the council members are going to, protest that. But someone could make a motion, in the case it goes over that, up not to exceed 20 or something in case.
I think due to the optics of this, you need to bring it back to council.
Yeah.
Well, no,
not so much
it says in the code that we have to confirm the person,
Correct.
Okay.
True.
and you wouldn't want it any other way. And so what I'm suggesting is it might be nice to have 2 or 3 candidates.
Oh, in order
Did we get-
to Bob's point, to make sure no one has any questions about their conflict of interest or
Correct.
friends with, me. And
But what I'm suggesting is what I'm trying to avoid is your office coming forward with a pick
Yep.
after great research or whatever, right? And then we're left with either approving or denying that person. That puts you in a difficult spot. It puts us in a difficult spot. So we do not want to be seen as rubber stamping anything. So what I'm suggesting is 2 or 3 options that you guys carefully cull would be a great opportunity for us to then pick from that list of 2 or 3 people. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's fine. I appreciate that. Yeah, that would be.
So, sorry, could I just, I want to go back to my question. Because it cannot be that the city is incapable of determining whether an employee had an apparent conflict of interest when they approved an invoice. Because if we're incapable of doing that, how will anyone ever approve an invoice again? We simply must be capable of determining it. And the follow-on question is, if we have some invoices that have been approved by someone in an apparent conflict of interest, we need to immediately have someone go re-review those invoices who does not have a conflict of interest and tell us whether those invoices have been properly approved. And I don't think we need, I guess I would need to understand, why do we need an outside person to tell us that? I think we've jumped on to a different issue, which is, if we conclude we have an apparent conflict of interest, then we're concerned with how do we deal with that employee or that situation. But I'm talking about the invoice. Can we figure out if we have invoices with problems? And why can't we?
I'm sorry, Councilman May, I'm not sure which invoice you're talking about.
I believe that not only does Dan sign the invoice, but you also sign the invoice.
But our
correct?
controls require 2. So if one of them's deficient, then our control's deficient. We cannot conclude that we're okay. We need someone who's to go back and do that. And if we go back and do that and discover that do think we had a few invoices approved in violation of our code, we've gone back and discovered actually they're fine. I don't know what we'll find, but let's say we find out that they're fine. Then I think
We were of the belief that those invoices were being checked off by 2 people, or sometimes 3. I don't want to have, I would recommend or suggest to council that we not make a conclusion on that issue. That's why we're talking about this hearings officer, to conduct the proper investigation, to ensure due process, and that a recommendation comes forth from a neutral third body. If we draw the conclusion now, we've already made our decision about the potential conflict of interest and or ethics violation that's being alleged.
Is it possible that the employee and contractor involved will not be disputing the facts and all your, is it possible these facts are not in dispute?
I think what more to the point is that Marcinko is being removed from reviewing these contracts for the balance of the contract.
I think he's asking a different question, though. I mean, but maybe a good segue. I know you wanted to make a statement tonight, Dan.
I wanted to address the issues, council members and mayor, so thank you for the lead-in. Associated with my investment in a company called Pacific Northwest Wines and Spirits, I am an investor. Actively look for opportunities, listen to many people looking for ways to invest for the future for me and my family. 3 kids in college. I was approached about investing in a company that would work to distribute wine from small wineries, meaning they produce less than 10,000 cases per year. Mr. Matson discussed this idea with me after he returned from Northern California, and I agreed to get involved. But I forgot about it because it never got off the ground. We didn't have any business, and not only no business, there was no profit, and nothing whatsoever. That being said, and I understand the statement that was made by City Administrator Larson, I should have revisited or remembered the investment when I was asked to be a direct supervisor of Miss Billington's contract. I want to offer my sincere apology and will most certainly learn from this mistake, and I'm willing to cooperate with the ethic inquiry to review my actions and conduct and will accept whatever findings that may come from the review and inquiry.
Thank you.
Dan, you didn't say when, you talked about you and Mattson talking about forming this. Was Lizzie in on those conversations, or she was a late arriver into that?
No, Matt approached me. I'm trying to remember if it was time frame and dates. I'd have to sit down and think it through or ask him, but quite a while ago, and it was just Matt approached me.
Did
So
you know at
maybe-
the time that Lizzie was part of it?
No.
Okay.
So she was already part of it?
Pardon?
No.
She was already part of it when you joined?
No, not that I'm aware of, no. I'm not sure when he asked her. I'd have to ask him and see timeframes and dates.
So in other words, I believe Lizzie knew Matt or had a relationship going back far before her contract with the city when she worked for the chamber and other activities in the valley. Is that correct?
I believe so, yes.
Councilor May, I don't know if that answered your question.
Well, it hits it square on the nail, which is if we now know that those invoices were in fact approved not in compliance with our code of conduct, we can go back and get that second control performed by someone who is independent, and we should do that right away. And in the process, we'll get an answer to the question of did that code of conduct issue result in, do we believe that there were any invoices improperly paid? Because we may discover upon having that additional review done that we don't believe that.
But the
So-
reason I think we need an independent investigator is because it's not just about the payroll. One of the other potential areas of conflict is, a company like this could have benefited from city contracts, right? So it's not just about, I'm not suggesting it happened. I'm just saying there are other ramifications of being involved in a business with a direct report beyond just payroll getting paid. And that's why I don't think, that's why I think as a council, we have to require that is somebody external that conducts that survey, 'cause
I'm fine with that.
Okay.
I'm saying that that's a separate question than whether these invoices have proper approval and were paid appropriately or not.
So I think at the heart of the matter is, and I think we're all dancing around the same issue, is do we believe that there was a code of conduct violation in terms of disclosure of the business, particularly when we were in the process of renewing the contract after they had entered into the business together? So that's kind of separate from, I think what Jim is talking about is more on on part of the investigation to ensure that the invoices are reviewed by the proper control, which is two individuals that have no conflict of interest, to determine that there was nothing improper done with one of the signatures, because you've negated that control with one person being quote-unquote tainted in the process.
That's right.
And it's kind of a really, I get what you're saying, Jim, because I live the life of auditing, and I get what you're saying about controls, and I think if you're not in it day to day, people don't understand what you're trying to get to in terms of a control. So what he is suggesting is, I think the administration needs to have a third party that has not touched these invoices review them to make sure that any of the ones that Dan signed, that there's nothing improper, even though they've been reviewed by a second person. From an audit point of view, you want to have two independent reviewers. Did
So,
That's
aside-
exactly
I
right.
maybe clarify that in any?
Aside from all of this discussion, why don't I just make a motion that we hire an independent auditor and the mayor brings to us the recommendations as to who that auditor will be, and let him go about his business.
What
That's a
took you
motion.
so long, Bob? We've been waiting all night.
To Councilmember Sunwall's point, though, perhaps not singular.
They're two different things.
You don't want me
They're-
cherry picking, you want some,
they're
like a
two-
choice.
Well, they're two different things. We want someone to audit the 12 or whatever months worth of payroll, not payroll, invoices that Mr. Marcinko signed. That's one person, okay? Separately, investigating the ethics issue, that's a group of people that I wanted to have 2 or 3 options to pick from. If we want to have 2 or 3 options to pick from the accountant or whatever that's going to independently come in and do this, whatever. But they're 2 different people. Right?
Yeah, and the first one, I expect could be
Next
an
week.
employee of the city.
You
Doesn't
could
need
do
to
an
be-
employee of the city.
Yeah.
It could be you.
Well, I don't have a role. That's actually inappropriate for a council member, but an employee.
I was just testing you.
Negates
I
his role.
was totally testing you on that.
Sure you were.
Well done.
All right.
Yeah,
So-
and
so
the
let's make a
auditor and the ethics officer have to be 2 different people because the code provision for the ethics officer specifies that they may hold no other appointed or elective office within the city. So
Correct.
they can't also
It's a
do
different
the
skill set
audit.
anyway, so
Well,
yeah,
correct.
yeah.
But
Okay.
Bob, back to the specific one on the ethics office, then Bob is prepared to make a motion. Sean, I was
I
just,
don't know how you make a motion when we don't have a person to
I don't have a budget,
appoint.
yeah.
I-
I think at this point, we don't need a motion, Bob. I've gotten a pretty unanimous kind of nod of heads. Go get this moving, get this put together, and bring back an agenda bill with us to approve
By
you know,
next council.
some choices and, and a general budget by next council. I mean, is that feasible, Bob?
Very feasible, yes. If council wants to call a special meeting, we can have it ready for next Monday night. It's just going to be limited. There aren't, as Bob Sturbank pointed out, there are some folks out there, but it's not an exhaustive list. There aren't that many that are performed, and usually it's with larger cities, and as Bob mentioned, those are difficult because they don't meet that often, but we'll bring back something next Monday. If you want to look at that for a special meeting, let us know that this week, and we can arrange it, or we'll bring it back for the November 13th meeting.
And just one other item that I was reminded, we forgot as a bullet point here too, to note that we did run an internal financial report to look for any sort of expenditures that had been made to Northwest LLC or wineries or whatever that their business was. And there was, to the point you made about possible double dealing, there was never any,
Also another good thing for that independent person to look at.
yeah.
Did we run I know we looked at invoices for time, but the city also agreed to pay quote-unquote approved expenses, and I didn't see any of that information. Can we get a report on the expenses that we have paid on behalf of Lizzie?
You got that, Jody? You making notes?
I'm making
Okay.
notes.
Yes.
All right. So if there's no further questions, council, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
I have a motion and a second to adjourn tonight's meeting. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion's carried. Enjoy the rest of your long evening.